CODERS from Missouri State University presents Spotlights.
You had mentioned a quote that I really interest me about magic versus science.
So Arthur C. Clarke was a very famous science fiction writer who also established a lot of other principles and ideas. Very brilliant man. And he had a quote that said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic," depending on which society you're in.
Okay, so meaning that the science will always have the same results, but then magic depends more on the person who performs it.
Well, so if you go back in time and you show somebody something that's amazing looking, they're going to think that you have some innate quality in yourself, and it will look like magic to them, and they'll think it's something you possess. But a scientist says it's something nature possesses, but it's not dependent upon the characteristics of the person unlocking the mystery. It's dependent upon the mystery itself.
I'm going to go back to that because it makes me think about teaching and what we do as educators, because I believe that in a way, although we are scientists, we also have some sort of power, special powers to be able to change the world. But I'll ask you, speaking about the world and the community, and I know this is a complex question, question, but you were talking about magnets and electric fields, and I asked you previously, magnetic fields. How would you?
So a magnetic field's a very
that?
Interesting thing. Physicists put names to things, and the names can be whimsical. They can just be placeholders. So they talk about things like charge. They talk about things like field, and people know what fields do. That is, they know what kinds of results fields will enact or make able to happen. We're going to rephrase that. People will know what fields do, but they don't necessarily know what fields are. So at some level, it's a stand-in for a piece of nature. They have to put a name to it because they know how it behaves, but they don't necessarily know what it is, so to speak, and that happens all the time in physics.
I work in a different field. I work in literature. So when I've seen you teach this by now, I think maybe like 5 times. And when you teach about magnetic fields, I think of a community.
Right.
And I've heard you, it's complex, it's hard to define. And I think that's how we are in a community. We have different characteristics of people. I've seen you define metals, plastic, different conducts.
Right.
I've seen you say many times you have to observe. You've made me taken the things away from me so that I can write notes and observe before I can make assumptions.
Sure.
And I do that with my students a lot before they make assumptions to the character, for instance, because I think as a society we tend to make assumptions for anything. When we run into people, when we meet somebody, we tend to make assumptions and label them.
One of the biggest problems we have in physics is people's preconceived notions that they bring with them from observations of the natural world. They make limited observations in certain very, very specific circumstances, mostly working with things like cars and stuff like that. And from that, they try to dial that into predictions about things that are much more nebulous, like electric and magnetic fields. So we find that if they're just left to their own devices to make a prediction or to make an assumption, they get it wrong a lot. So we always emphasize you must let the observations lead you to the answer. You cannot presuppose the answer and look for the observations that back that up. That's exactly the wrong way to do science.
Being in the CODERS project, I think my biggest takeaway has been to understand this wording from a physicist, because I work a lot with the diversity and inclusion, and especially for social justice and in literature. And as a lawyer, I think that, I teach my students not to make assumptions. I always tell them, make observations, get to know people, go beyond the box, right? And I never thought that we had so much in common. And when I see this lesson, especially, thinking about intersections, right? I think of myself, for instance. I am a Latina, but I'm also non-Catholic. I'm also the firstborn. I'm also from the Ozarks already, because I've been here longer than what I've been in Mexico.
Right.
And I tell students, right, if you make assumptions, you're going to fail. You're going to be wrong, right? You're going to stop making that connections that the community, that the magnetic field really, really needs, because we're seeking for commonalities, right?
Well, you know, one of the things that I think about is I wrote a line once in a song that says, we see each other through eyes distorted by the past. And you would say that happens to people all the time. They already have notions about what a person should or should not act like or be like based on all these various characteristics. And in physics, that really caused major problems about 125 years ago when people thought they knew from prior knowledge the way things should behave. And then a whole bunch of stuff at the beginnings of the 20th century really didn't behave that way, and they were completely at a loss for about 15 years where they didn't know why any of the things were behaving the way they did, and they had to throw away a whole bunch of old assumptions in the way they looked at the world. So even though it's STEM and the arts, this idea that they have commonalities just in the way they're even done, or the way people use, the way people have prejudices. People have scientific prejudices. For a long, long time, we know now that plates move, the plates on the earth move. Now that was held in complete disrepute for a long, long time. No geologist wanted to accept that because it went against conventional wisdom until finally the evidence was so strong that they couldn't reject it any longer. So this happens all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I see a lot of empowerment when I see the circuits.
Sure.
And the predictions that we make and how we think that it's the bulbs are gonna light up, and then you have your own predictions, and then we see it fail, and then once it lights up depending on the resistance and all
Sure.
of so I see a lot of empowerment, and I see a lot of empowerment with knowledge and also through observation, and I think we're missing a lot when we just fail to make those, we fail into taking the time to make those relationships because we just have assumptions, and that's when we stop making those connections.
That's the interesting thing. Obviously, human interactions and the complexity associated with our community is much larger than basically the complexity of even a physical system. And physicists or any kind of scientists always, if they're doing it correctly, they don't have an allegiance to anything except what their experiment tells them next. That's their only allegiance. Now, it gets mixed up all the time. They get caught up in the same nonsense that everybody else does, their own prestige and their own reputation and all those things. But much of the time, as you know, in society, people won't allow their preconceptions to be knocked down because they have such a connection to them that it makes it hard. In science, if you are so committed to an old notion, you can never be a good scientist, ever. You will never, we all are doing our own small part. I'm responsible for one tiny thread in a gigantic tapestry. As a scientist, that is what you must be comfortable with, that you're one tiny little thread in a gigantic picture. And the funny thing that I've heard described is on the back of those tapestries, all the knots are there. And on the front, you see the picture and it looks all beautiful. But behind the scenes is all the hard work that had to be done that you never see, where people had to decide this was wrong and this was right. They untie this, they tie this. And in science, it's done all the time. And people, they have to let their ego go. It's very difficult.
Yeah,
but they do.
I guess in philosophy, we see it as humbleness. Right? It's a journey. It's an ongoing journey of knowing that you don't know, and then keep on in the journey of continuous learning. And I guess on that note, I would like to say that we've tested this because when we had this lesson on magnetism with fourth graders, right? And then we had fourth graders write whatever came to their minds, either a free writing or a poem or something, and we have on the board what one of the girls wrote on magnets. So in a way, it wasn't just me thinking about community, but this little girl wrote, fast, strong, speed of light, tired, recharged, and all over every time. Family and friends is all we have. So she saw this magnet field as a community, as a way of recharging herself, as a way of empowering, or empowerment for herself and for everybody. So, in a way, to me, it's a way to reflect that it's not science or physics and then literature or writing, separate things.
It shouldn't be.
And it shouldn't be. And many times as educators, we are so much or afraid to bring these things together into the classroom when it's really all, part of one thing.
Well, it's hard enough when I've met somebody who taught Shakespeare only for maybe 20 years. So if that happens just in English, then you can imagine how sometimes there ends up with this dichotomy where people, they do arts and you do STEM. The one thing you were talking about earlier that I think is very important is that when you first show people that they can actually have the ability to unlock nature to do its thing themselves. And it doesn't require a special characteristic. It only requires that they do these things that have been studied. They learn power, and that's great. And then the thing that's on the other side of it, which we try to always teach is, and people wonder about this because they ask scientists many times, how can you be comfortable with so much not knowing? And that's the one thing you have to be really comfortable with as a scientist. There's a lot more that you don't know than you do know. And I think that's true in the arts or anything like that also.
Right. There's a lot of knowledge that we don't know, and it's okay, right? Because we're in that constant change. And students will pick up on that, and they will also be okay with that vulnerability because you learn from them, right? Sure. Every day you learn from the students. I think they have no idea on how much they teach me every day that I walk into the classroom. And that's why I asked you that quote on the very first day, when we started here, and about magic and science. Sure. Because to me, yes, science, it's going to be the same every time, but I believe that every teacher is a magician.
I agree.
Because we can do anything we want in the classroom. And for every teacher that we're working with this year and the next year, and however this project goes on, that I hope that it goes on forever, I think that when we go into the classroom and we have students, I think magic happens when we can, transform and we can set the tone for students so that they can understand that they can learn and do something with that knowledge ongoing. That they can really be empowered like this circuit and be part of a community and feel part of that circuit to be a change, then we have done our job.
No, I agree. And the only thing I would say is a takeaway are two things. First of all, Arthur C. Clarke was a novelist and a writer. He was not officially a scientist per se. Isaac Asimov, a very famous science fiction writer, had a PhD in biochemistry, but he spent most of his life writing about science, and yet he had more impact in many cases with things like the 3 laws of robotics and other ideas from his fertile mind, that he had more impact as a writer, writing about these big issues for which the technical pieces were not the hardest part. It was the social pieces, the big decisions that have to be made. You can see all this coming to the fore with things like robots. The robot part will get figured out. We're going to have robots that can do all sorts of things shortly. It's the bigger issues, the social issues. What happens to people? Are people still enabled? Are people taken care of? Do people have opportunity? Those are much bigger questions, and they're much more difficult questions in almost every case. And then the second thing, when you talked about us being magicians, you and I just discussed this beforehand, is the great thing about it is anybody in our room with the will, if they have the will, they can also become one of these magicians, so to speak. They don't have to say their heritage or their background precludes them from being one themselves. Whereas in the wizarding world, whether it's Lord of the Rings, with which I am most familiar and happy, or whether it's Harry Potter, it's your own makeup that's pre-constituted in you that makes you a magician or doesn't. And that's not true in science or in teaching, I don't think.
I think as teachers, we have the power to make a change in those kids' lives.
I think you're right.
Yeah, I think so. So then, I think it is wanting to make, that classroom and making magic happening when we have, the 4 walls and, a chalk. Well, it's not a chalk anymore, a marker, and
and our symbols and incantations.
Yeah, and then magic will happen.
I think that's a great way to end this up.
Yeah. This is Dave Cornelison.
And Judith Martinez.
For CODERS Council.
Adios.
Adios.